You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Good afternoon. Welcome. My name's Lise Grande. I'm the head of the United States Institute of Peace. We are a public, nonpartisan institution that was established in 1984, dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. In today's world, this mandate sometimes means that not only do we address active conflicts, but also that we help to establish and maintain mechanisms and tools that increase stability and prevent future conflicts. We're very pleased to have the opportunity this afternoon to explore one such potential mechanism, the growing political and security partnerships between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its partner countries in the Indo-Pacific, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand. This topic is the subject of a new report that a USIP expert study group has just issued. It's available online, and we have hard copies outside for all of you. My main role this afternoon is to welcome two of the most respected gentlemen in Washington, Deputy Secretary of State, Dr. Campbell, and former National Security Advisor and former chair of USIP's board, my boss, Stephen Hadley. Following their discussion, we're delighted to welcome a number of colleagues who are going to be part of a panel. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Douglas Jones, State Department Senior Advisor for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Ellison Laskowski, former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Operations, John Manza, and Chair of the USIP Senior Study Group on NATO and Indo-Pacific Partners, Mirna. The Washington Summit in July is going to mark the third year in a row that the leaders of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea join NATO counterparts at an alliance summit. There's a lot to talk about at the summit and a lot at stake in these discussions, including the return of strategic competition to the international system, threats to the rules-based international order from Russia's war in Ukraine, the realities that are posed by a more assertive China, and urgent transnational problems, including climate change and emerging disruptive technologies. As the NATO alliance enters its 75th year, some of the challenges we face together are familiar, but others are now far more complex and fast evolving than could have been imagined at the first NATO meeting in Washington in 1949. Our aim is to talk about these challenges today and how they can be addressed through new partnerships that are focused on deterrence and information exchange and interoperability, and can also be addressed through cooperation and goodwill, which are the basis of our shared pursuit of peace and stability. Deputy Secretary, may we invite you to the floor.
So, Kurt, thank you very much for being with us. We're going to have a conversation here for maybe 20, 30 minutes, and then Kurt is going to depart. We're going to invite the panelists to come up. Part two of the program will be discussion with the panelists of this terrific report, which I recommend all of you pick up as you leave if you haven't gotten it already. It's a great job. So, Kurt, I'm going to start and give you a bit of a softball on this one. But it's an opportunity to say what you think we need to hear. But 75 years ago, no one could have imagined that an integrated Union of European states, let alone the President of the Republic of Korea and the Prime Ministers of Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, would be joining NATO member states for regular summit meetings. Yet that is what's now occurring. How did we get there, and how should we feel about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, Steve, let me just take a moment to say thank you for the invite to help commemorate the report that's just been issued. Lisa, I want to thank you and your team. You have a great panel, including Doug Jones, distinguished member of the EOR team, also our other colleagues. that will be joining as well. I do want to just say just a few things, if I can, as we get started. I've never been to this part of the U.S. Institute of Peace. This is some of the most magnificent architectural integration I've ever seen. I want you all to know we've been scouting around Washington where we might hold the AP4, soon to be IP4, I think, and I think we have found our site. So we're thrilled. It's just magnificent. And then just the last word, I'm sorry, this is not filler. These are sincere. Grateful to do anything with Steve Hadley. I don't think there's a person who has done more in a bipartisan context to support American purpose. When you look at the people that this building is dedicated after President Bush and President Clinton, it was people like Steve that helped propel national purpose in many important endeavors. I just want to say as we get started, I'm deeply focused on the upcoming summit. This is an opportunity for us to both take stock, Steve, and then also kind of look into the future. I don't think anyone could have imagined 75 years ago, if you look at all the things that have been accomplished over this time, first, victory in the Cold War, return of conflict, terrible conflict on the continent of Europe, inclusion of new members that no one would have ever thought would have met the sort of terms of membership, and now a recognition that security and other issues transcend the simple geographic boundaries of Europe. And so I think the fact that countries in the Indo-Pacific have expressed an interest and a focus on NATO as an organization and member states in terms of the core missions of understanding disinformation, cybersecurity, and larger sort of challenges strategically, I think is very important. I will also say, Steve, I think, in the past we've always thought about how countries in Europe may focus on the Indo-Pacific and, either with the United States or alone. It is interesting that the most decisive expression of the linkages that are now emerging between the Indo-Pacific and Europe run the other direction. It is the countries of the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and others that decisively got behind support for Ukraine and have made consistent messaging of the importance of prevailing. 2 weeks ago, when President Biden hosted Prime Minister Kishida, and he spoke to a joint session of Congress, people on the Hill were a little surprised that virtually the first thing that Prime Minister Kishida raised was the essential struggle that we are focused on, and that victory or avoiding defeat was essential prerequisite for maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. I think he and other leaders in the Indo-Pacific recognize the connectivity between these two distinct regions, but we are now combined by many other things, and there is a sense that common purposes, common approaches to global security overcome simple sort of geographic differences. And I will say that what we've also seen over the course of the last few years is a Russia that is bolstered by partnership with both China and North Korea in ways that are antithetical not only to our security interests in Europe, but also the Indo-Pacific.
So I'm going to, this relationship between NATO and NATO countries and our Indo-Pacific allies, I think is pretty popular in Washington. It reflects the consensus we have that we've got to get serious about the challenge presented by China. I want to ask you a couple questions to poke a little bit at that.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I would begin with is, so how has China reacted to this increasing cooperation between NATO and our Indo-Pacific friends and allies?
Well, Steve, first of all, just to set the context, as we go forward here, I think it is incumbent on us to tell our story carefully and to explain exactly what our purposes are and what they are not. We are not proposing that NATO explore out-of-area contingencies in the Indo-Pacific. That is far from what we believe the current dialogues are about. We also think it is critical that that countries in the Indo-Pacific understand exactly what the nature of our conversations are about and the limitations of what's being discussed. And so, for instance, there are important member state relationships with NATO. There are interactions more generally, but there is no real proposition of some combining force that would integrate countries in the Indo-Pacific into some formal self-defense Article 5, Article 9 structures in NATO. That is not what is being discussed or articulated. I think it would be fair to say that that China and Russia have for years, not recently, but for years, had a drumbeat of very negative information.
You have a mic problem.
Sorry. Okay. We spent like hours putting this microphone on and it doesn't work. So it's a wonderful building, but we still need to work on the technology. So I would say that's a joke, Steve. Don't worry. It's okay. It's fine. It's a good technology. So virtually any move that the United States or other countries sought to make on the security side in the Indo-Pacific was labeled like the importation of NATO into the Indo-Pacific in very negative ways. And I will say that I think it would be fair to say that this information space has been very effectively played by Chinese disinformation and Russian disinformation. So as you travel around the Pacific and Southeast Asia, you will often hear questions about, NATO ambitions. What are you doing in the Indo-Pacific? Part of one of the reasons that I'm so pleased by this report and the work that it will underscore is that we do have to tell our story better. We have to explain clearly, first of all, the critical role. If you had to point to one institution, Steve, over the last 70 years that you can stand up and sort of focus on the distance, take some pride in, it would be NATO. And in truth, it is a case study of how countries can work together to solve problems, all the challenges that it's faced. It has overcome over decades, even during periods where people thought that the West was in decline or would collapse. So I think these partnerships will be important. They help countries understand how to take security interests seriously. I will say that some of the initial discussions are around disinformation. They're around cyber-related issues. They're around narratives that are negative, like what we are confronting with respect to how NATO is depicted in Indo-Pacific countries. I think the AP4 summit gives us the opportunity to feature how these four responsible members of Five Eyes, independent states, not all of them, but Australia and New Zealand, plus Japan and South Korea, how these four states have played such a responsible role in not only security in their region, but each of the leaders of these countries desires to play an increasing global role. And when we say a global role, in the past that had often meant in the global south. But what we're seeing increasingly are responsible voices indicating that the links between countries in Northeast Asia, for instance, and Europe are tight, important, and should be furthered. I'll also say, Steve, one of the things that's important, we've talked about this before. I worked on the Indo-Pacific for a long period of time. When I was in the Obama administration, there was something that emerged called the pivot or the rebalance. And I've said this before, but most initiatives that you launch in government disappear almost immediately without anyone noticing it. And you point it to people and they're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. On the very rare occasions when you do something that takes off, then you're left with a different set of challenges, which are how do you deal with the unintended consequences of an initiative that you laid out. The most important unintended consequence of this was a sense that somehow we were pivoting away from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. That was a serious mistake, and in fact, completely contrary to our interests and our desires. Everything that the United States has ever done of purpose on the global stage, we have done with Europe, and I expect that that will be the case as we go forward. And it's also the case, Steve, as we've looked and thought about the Indo-Pacific strategy, I'm proud to say that one of the most important features of that are not just advanced partnerships and engagement with the Indo-Pacific, but with Europe. Dramatic dialogues, some countries, almost a dozen interactions in which we explore joint issues and engagements. In the past, when you talked about a country in Europe's Indo-Pacific strategy, that was largely how they thought about China. What we're now seeing in Europe is a broad interest in the region as a whole, advancing relations in technology with Japan and South Korea, markets in Southeast Asia, how to think about engaging India, and yes, how to have a responsible relationship with China as well.
So, Kurt, let me come back to you on what you've just said and ask you this question. So when you have your interactions with China, what do you say to them when they say this increased relationship between NATO and your allies, America's allies in the Indo-Pacific, is part of an effort to encircle China, constrain China, keep China down? And what do you say, sort of part two of that question, to some critics here who say that by emphasizing a renewed relationship between NATO and the countries in the Asia-Pacific, and our own pressure on countries to do more for their own defense, we're in fact going to get a further Chinese military buildup of both their conventional forces and their nuclear forces. So we're, in some sense, creating the security challenge that we'd like to avoid. So what do you say to the Chinese, and then what do you say to those critics?
Yeah. So look, we often hear from Chinese friends and interlocutors about how the United States is seeking to strangle or undermine commercially or economically or surround China. And I think it's important to take a moment and to provide just a little bit of context before we depart on this question. If you look at the last 40 or 50 years, you could make an argument that these are the best 40 or 50 years in China's history. Remarkable creation of wealth, innovation, lifting nearly 1 billion people out of poverty. Now, you have to credit the ingenuity and the effectiveness of the Chinese people, but it is undoubtedly the case that they accomplished this with the help of countries in the international system. Probably no country has helped more than the United States. Open markets, investment, support for joining international institutions, highly debatable now, and also, as importantly, the maintenance of peace and stability that the United States has provided in the Indo-Pacific for decades. These have provided, in many respects, the conditions that have allowed China to rise, to thrive, and to develop more generally. Steve, I would largely answer directly to Chinese friends that I do not see the actions that the West, the United States, and Europe is taking as somehow initiating Chinese responses on the nuclear or military side. I think many of those plans were already well underway and advanced at the time that I think sometimes reluctantly and slowly groups in the West recognized that it was in our own best interest to work together to confront and engage on challenges that were posing severe threats and concerns to our mutual security and prosperity. And so I would say, and I try to explain this to Chinese friends, much of what we've done is not designed to thwart China directly. It is designed to preserve and protect the institutions and the capabilities, the hard-won operating system that we have developed together. I would also say that I even hear from Chinese interlocutors sometimes quietly when we press them on their relationship with Russia. I will say, look at the partners you are choosing, the partners that you chose to propel yourself on the international stage, the United States, Japan, South Korea, other Southeast Asian countries. You have now pivoted to work most closely with Russia, with North Korea, increasingly with Iran. I think that sends a signal on the global stage that is concerning not just in Washington, Steve, but across capitals in Europe as well.
Clearly, if NATO started signing up as members, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, it would be a red flag to China. But what about the argument that some have made that NATO being the most successful military alliance in history, we should not bring NATO into the Indo-Pacific, but we should create, if you will, a NATO look-alike in the Indo-Pacific, pulling together our friends and allies in a more structured self-defense arrangement, NATO-like. What would China's reaction be to that, and would be the reaction of our friends and allies if we put forward?
So look, Steve, I think what we have tried to do over the course of the administration, building on bipartisan efforts for some time. Look, the defense and security architecture in Asia is quite different than the architecture in Europe. I don't need to tell you this. And in fact, multilateralism in Asia is a relatively new thing. You can recall, I remember when I first met Steve back in the 1990s, late 80s, we were debating whether it was in American interest to support the development of multilateral institutions in the region that have now taken wing in many respects. What we are seeing is the United States has a series of important bilateral relationships in the region, and then a number of informal ties with other countries. I think the goal has been to not only diversify those links, bring new partners in, but to create cross-cutting partnerships that are minilateral and sometimes purpose-driven. It is our able ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, calls it the lattice work fence arrangement in the Indo-Pacific. I think for right now, the building blocks that we are seeking is not only to strengthen our bilateral relationships of the kind that we've seen when Prime Minister Kishida was here again a week and a half ago. And I would just have all of you just take a moment to consider the depth of the bilateral accomplishments. It is remarkable. It is an update of a now 70-year-old relationship in ways that are completely unprecedented. But we've added to that by, again, trilateral, minilateral groupings, the Quad that brings all the maritime major democracies of the Indo-Pacific together, AUKUS that seeks to provide nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines, and then other elements of AUKUS that will hopefully over time integrate other like-minded countries in joint technological pursuits. The important trilateral at Camp David between the United States, Japan, and South Korea that sought to bridge decades of real serious divisiveness. And then most recently, Steve, a week and a half ago, the one between Japan, the Philippines, and the United States. We think these efforts, along with strengthened bilateral relationships with countries like Vietnam, increasingly like-minded on security issues, and a major project that we are all engaged in, which is trying to develop a stronger relationship with India, given its critical and central role on the global stage. These efforts together, we believe, provide a kind of security ballast in the Indo-Pacific that will be sustaining, that gives confidence to member nations, and helps provide the maintenance of peace and stability. I will also say we believe, and I think what you will see in July, that the AP4, Steve, is now rising to the level of this kind of strategic initiative that will be integrated into the other efforts that we're undertaking.
I think you may have answered my question, but let me put it on the table. You've done a fantastic job about strengthening these bilateral relationships with individual countries. You've also created a number of different architectures for different purposes that involve not necessarily the same group of countries, though there is a core group. All of that seems to be going extremely well, to be well received in the region, and China is fussing, but it proceeds nonetheless. The USIP report talks about the AP4, the IP4, as a sort of an issue of some sensitivity in the region.
Yeah.
There are differences among the four members. Why, given your success on the bilateral relationship and on these AUKUS and all these other institutions, trilateral relations that you've got, why raise up the IP4 and try to institutionalize it? Isn't that, in some sense, giving a target for the Chinese and some neuralgia for the region that you don't need, given all the great work you've done bilaterally and these and other mechanisms?
Well, Steve, look, it's a great question, and it's an important question. And I will say that launching any one of these initiatives, we have faced challenges. There are domestic critics of the engagement between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. It has been criticized broadly in South Korea, and there are some concerns in Japan. I did not mention the work that we're doing in the Pacific, which has initially confronted with doubt and concerns whether the United States would follow through and whether we could be counted on as a stable and steady presence in a region where we were once very important and largely departed from. So I think even though in some of these circumstances that you sometimes confront early doubts and disagreements, it's important to both strategically formulate what you're seeking, what you think is in the best interests of the United States and other countries, advance that, and then recognize that to be effective, it is no longer important to just design something in an elegant structure. You've got to get out there and explain it and defend it. That's one of the reasons I am here today, is to commend the work that USIP is doing, which is remarkable and important. This is the first report of its kind that really explores what the potential is. If I could say one last thing, Steve, it also suggests that for a lot of these initiatives, that it is the United States that is the sole architect. Nothing could be further from the truth. Many of these initiatives are driven by strong-willed countries with their own strategic sense. I would argue 15 years ago, no one would have said, look, some of the biggest, most interesting strategic concepts that would be introduced on the global stage would come from Japan, for instance. But the Indo-Pacific concept, the free and open concept, was a powerful tool that helped synthesize how to think about the region, promoted by Prime Minister Abe. It is Prime Minister Kishida that is so interested and focused, along with the leaders of Japan, of South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, who are themselves promoting the idea of working more closely with European partners in NATO. And I think it is incumbent on the United States to encourage that, to shape that, and to work in the best possible way with them. I also have to say, Steve, this is a hard thing to be so direct about, but sometimes when a country is really unhappy with something, it can also mean that you're on the right track, right? And so, sometimes we do get concerns and questions about the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that might mean that we're doing some things more effectively than others might believe.
That sets up really what is my last question. There's a lot going on in the region. You've described it bilaterally with these countries in the United States, with NATO, with European countries. how is it playing in their domestic politics? Both these governments in Japan and South Korea are under considerable domestic pressure at home. Is this pivot in their defense relationships that you've described contributing to that discontent? And do we run the risk in some sense of undermining these governments and breaking their politics if we move too quickly on this?
Gosh, these are hard questions, Steve. I mean, look, I don't think it should be lost on anyone that in many countries in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific and the United States, we have leaders with challenged opinion polls, right? And I think it is also the case that there is some disenchantment and anxiety about what democracy more in general can provide. I actually think one of the most important reasons why these venues are so important, and I have seen it personally, like I know, and Steve, you have too, you're even much more close, the burdens that our senior leaders feel, the weight of history, and sometimes the ability to sit down and work in common purpose with other democratic partners is deeply reassuring and confidence providing and provoking. And so I actually believe one of the most important things that countries can do when they face domestic challenges is to recognize that you take, purpose and courage and strength from gathering with others. It is undeniable that in the Indo-Pacific, it's hard to sometimes make the argument about why out-of-area thinking is complicated. But I would simply say that's not unique to Japan and South Korea. If you look at the debate that occurred here on Capitol Hill over the weekend and on Friday, you saw very clear voices arguing that it's not in American interests to be spending so much time and to be focused on other people's problems. We should be focused domestically. I believe that we're best able to, confront those nationalist impulses when we work collectively and effectively together. I'll also say Prime Minister Kishida, President Yoon, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Albanese, when they left Washington after what I would consider, and remember we've done the Quad now in terms of state visits, each of them saw a substantial bump in their popularity, which means probably, substantial. That working with the United States is still important and popular, even in highly contested domestic circumstances.
We've come to the end of the time for this first portion of the program. I'm sorry we did not have time for audience Q&A. We're trying to pack a lot into this time. I apologize for that. Please stay tuned. Kurt is going to depart. We're going to bring the panel up here, and we're going to talk about this terrific report. But please join me in thanking Kurt Campbell for being with us today.
Just a last word. There is such a distinguished group in this audience. I hope you have an opportunity to engage on this report, and I want to encourage everyone to take a look at. Thank you for putting it out. It touches on all the issues, honestly, that we are confronting. I will tell you, even though we're going to face some headwinds on this, Steve, we're going to press ahead.
Good. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So let me invite the panelists to come to the stage, and we'll continue this discussion. So Lise has already introduced the panelists briefly. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them. And I think you will conclude at the end that we could not have a better group here to talk about this issue. I'm going to start with Mirna Galic, who's at the end. And she was the chair of the USIP Expert Study Group on NATO and the Indo-Pacific partners that produced the report that's out on the tables outside. She is a USIP senior policy analyst for for China and East Asia. She's worked at the Department of State, in the Senate, and at the United Nations, well-traveled in her professional career. Doug Jones is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and oversees European issues and security, including NATO, OSCE, conventional arms control, and Arctic security. A robust portfolio indeed. From 2018 to 2021, he served as Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Mission in NATO. Thanks for being with us. Ellison Laskowski is a senior advisor in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. Her areas of focus include NATO's Indo-Pacific partners. Her previous posts include the Department of State's Office of Policy Planning and the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. And last but not least, John Manza served as NATO Assistant Secretary General for Operations from 2018 to 2022, where his responsibilities included alliance exercises, plans, and defense capacity building with partner nations. He currently serves as the Executive Director of the Haiti Interagency Working Group in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and that's an assignment that will keep you busy for some time. I want to thank the panelists for coming and joining us this afternoon. And I'd like to begin with Mirna and ask her really to summarize the report. I hope you all take a copy of it. I hope you all read it. And when the members of the audience do, Mirna, what are they going to find? And what do you think is going to surprise them that they might not have known before they picked up the report?
Super. Well, thank you so much, Steve. So in addition to the report, I'll give a quick summary also of the study group, and I'll start with why we decided to undertake this project. So as President Grande mentioned in her opening remarks, we were very interested in the potential of NATO and Indo-Pacific partner relations as a potential mechanism of stability in the region. And what we really wanted to do was understand the perspectives of the partner countries on both their deepening relations with NATO and on the growing interest in them from the Euro-Atlantic. So we had a fantastic set of experts. We had 2 from each of the partner countries and 4 from NATO ally countries. And each of these folks had focused before on their relations with NATO, their country's relations with NATO, or NATO's relations with the Indo-Pacific. And the number of people who are experts on this issue is very slim. So we were very lucky to get the right folks in the room. And they were an absolute joy to work with. So we started out with the right people, and I think that kind of set the tone for our ability to go where we went eventually. So the report looked at a number of issues. In addition to national level interests in NATO, we looked at 4 main areas. First, we looked at the history of NATO's engagement on the region and with its regional partners, not only bilaterally, but also as a group of 4, which, as we've mentioned, has various names, but we're calling in the report the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4. Second, we looked at trends among the partner countries on certain issues. So one of them was expectations of NATO on the region. Another one was views on NATO and China, and the final one was views on NATO and Ukraine. The third area the report looks into is how these partners see themselves as being grouped into the IP4. Are they happy with it, how they feel about it, and what they think its potential is as a mechanism. And then lastly, we looked at public diplomacy and strategic messaging on relations between NATO and these partner countries. And the group made some observations and outlined some policy options in each of these areas, which I will only briefly go through since we don't have a lot of time. But that's why you have the report available to you, and we do hope that you will take a look at it. So in terms of NATO on the region, the alliance has a very long history of engaging on the region and with its partners in the region. One that precedes the NATO recognition of China as a potential security challenge, which only happened in 2019, by at least a decade if you go back to when these partners started their partnership agreements with NATO in the late 2010s, or more than 2 decades if you go back to the beginning of NATO's engagement with Japan, and then the countries cooperating with NATO on its mission in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. NATO actually even carried out 3 consecutive counter-piracy missions in the Indian Ocean between 2009 and 2016, which were welcomed by regional countries, including China. So it's really important to kind of keep this history in mind because China rather, is really painting NATO's interest in the region as new and foreign and unfairly all about China. And if you look at the history, this is simply not accurate. So on the trends among the partner countries, I'll just pull out what I think are the most interesting ones in each category, essentially. So on NATO and the region, none of the partner countries expect NATO to be a significant direct actor on the Indo-Pacific. Instead, what they want is the alliance to coordinate with them on issues of mutual concern in, stemming from, or affecting the region. What the study group basically characterized as NATO with the Indo-Pacific, not in the Indo-Pacific. On China, although all of the partner countries want to be invited to participate in relevant internal discussions on China at NATO, none of them appear to want their cooperation with NATO to be characterized as being about China. And finally, on the question of Ukraine, this was really the area where the four countries are the closest in terms of their positions. All of them are very concerned about Russia's war against Ukraine, and all of them see this as a security problem, not just for Europe, but also for their region. They see Russia's abrogation of the rules-based international order as problematic, both in itself, in that they see the rules-based order as necessary for their prosperity and security, just as Europe does, but also because of the signals this abrogation sends to China and North Korea. And all four of these countries have placed sanctions on Russia and coordinated with NATO on aid delivery to Ukraine. Let me just take this off and hold it. So in terms of views from the partner countries on the IP4 grouping, so for my very first meetings at NATO at the beginning of 2022, both partner country officials and NATO officials strongly emphasized the importance of the bilateral relationship between NATO and each of these countries. So that remains, I think, a priority for both groups. But the fact of the matter is that the IP4 grouping is a fact on the ground, and it's something that's gained in prominence over the past couple of years. So as a result of this, what's important is that the countries understand how best to take advantage of this fact for their national and regional goals. And we discuss in the report some of the benefits of the grouping, and we also suggest that these partner countries first internally and then as a group kind of take a look at how they can take greater strategic advantage of being the IP4 essentially. On the question of public diplomacy and outreach to partner countries, the quick summary is we need more of it. Basically, there's still a relatively limited understanding of NATO at public levels in all the countries and even within policy circles across countries. And this is really important, as Steve and Kurt Campbell also mentioned, because China is picking up its negative messaging on NATO in the region. And then the last area, the strategic rationales for engagement, we really wanted to clarify why these kinds of relations are important in a way that can resonate with policymakers both in these partner countries and at NATO. And given the changes stemming from Russia's war in Ukraine and from the return of strategic competition in the international system, the study group basically looked at three possible strategic rationales for engagement that go beyond what we've traditionally had with partners in NATO, which is the narratives of shared values and transnational threats. So essentially, very generally, the three we looked at, they focused on one, the connections between NATO and the regions, between the two regions that make them more relevant for one another's security than was previously perceived. Second, we looked at the growing interdependence of deterrence dynamics in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific with the rise of strategic competition between the US and China. And third, we looked at the impact of strategic competition on transnational threats. So basically, for example, cybersecurity, but in the context of geopolitical tensions between the major powers, or non-proliferation, but in the context of Russia's saber-rattling over Ukraine, so these kinds of things. And basically, the group felt that more systemic discussion between NATO and the Indo-Pacific partners on these issues would help improve each side's situational awareness and coordinate perceptions. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. One of the things that surprised me about the report was where you started, which was that there's long-standing relations between NATO and some of our closest security partners in the Asia-Pacific, which I was not aware of. There's another sense in the report, there's a tone, and it picks up a little bit my question to Kurt Campbell, and it's a question really I want to put to all members of the panel. There's a sense in which there's a certain fragility about the IP4. There's certain sensitivities in the region. There's certain differences among the participants of the IP4 on some of the issues. You mentioned that. So the question I would have is from a U.S. perspective, Are NATO IP4 relations and this emerging role for the IP4 a fleeting trend, or are they here to stay? As Kurt said, is this something that we work on over time and it becomes part of the fabric of the architecture in the region? So how do you see it? Is it fleeting? Are we seeing something that's here to stay, a new institution? And what makes you think so? So why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. It's been great reading through the report, great listening to the remarks thus far, and I'm very honored to be joined by colleagues up here on stage. I think my main job here today, too, is to support what the Deputy Secretary has said, but I don't disagree. I think that this is not a fleeting moment. I think the fabric is well woven at this point and is here to stay. The point that you touched on, that he touched on, that going back over decades, looking at the historical cooperation between these four on some really important issues, shows the depth of the foundation of these relationships. He also touched earlier on sort of their bilateral nature, the growth that we see around the world on interconnected transnational threats, the interconnectedness of one region to another in responding to these shared threats, the growing list of areas of practical cooperation that I think we can touch on in a little bit, but hybrid threats, emerging threats, cyber, responding to disinformation, all give us a really long list of reasons to believe that this cooperation will continue to deepen.
So I agree with your main point. It's not fleeting. This is something that's for the long term. And I think it's important to think that not only, as you said, is this not new, but I think also the partnerships with the Indo-Pacific are also not unique. We often talk about it as if that's the only area where NATO has sort of these deep partnerships, but NATO concluded quite a long time ago that Euro-Atlantic security is tied to security elsewhere in the world. And so NATO has 35 partnerships around the world. It has partnerships in Africa. It has partnerships in the Middle East in an actual formalized structure in the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, because NATO knows that what happens elsewhere impacts in Euro-Atlantic security. And that's the same basic conclusion that's driving this deepening relationship with Indo-Pacific partners, because we know what is happening in the Indo-Pacific impacts Euro-Atlantic security, and our Indo-Pacific partners are realizing that what's happening in the Euro-Atlantic space is impacting them. And so this is this increasing realization that there are these interplays between what happens in the Euro-Atlantic area and elsewhere is only becoming more prominent. And I think what's driving a lot behind the increased focus on Indo-Pacific is it's China is becoming more of a factor in Euro-Atlantic security, but also we're seeing more and more examples of how the security is linked, and Ukraine being the most recent example that's driving this, as we've seen how the PRC's support for Russia economically and supporting their defense industrial base is impacting the war in Ukraine. We're seeing how ammunition and missiles coming from the DPRK to Russia is helping them prosecute the war in Ukraine. And then on the flip side, the conclusion that the outcome of what happens in Ukraine will deeply impact security in the Indo-Pacific, and what conclusions the PRC may raise if Putin's invasion of Ukraine does not end in defeat. They may take wrong lessons that would have serious consequences in the Indo-Pacific. So I think all trends are there's a strong basis for why we have this dialogue and these connections, and it's growing stronger.
Thanks very much, Doug. John, how do you see it?
So I think the cooperation, maybe up until fairly recently, was more at a political level, at almost a token level. But then over time, especially with the rise of China and now the world kind of bifurcating into totalitarian states and democracies recognizing the threat from China, Russia, North Korea. Maybe you'd put Iran in that mix. I see this as increasingly important. It started really, in my mind, in 2019 in London, when finally allies were able to get over that hump and talk about China more in terms like you hear here in Washington, and just recognize the threat from a rising China. But up until that point, there was a lot of reticence on both sides, I think, in the Pacific Rim and amongst allies. Many allies simply didn't want to discuss what was happening in the Pacific Rim as a threat to their own security. But certainly Ukraine has helped foster that thinking.
Mirna, you want to give us the last word on that
Sure.
question? Do you want to use the handheld mic? Would that
Yeah.
be easier for you?
Thank you. So I think there's a reason that these countries are playing as prominent a role as they are in the region, and it has to do a lot with their democraticness, the strong militaries, their strong economic performance, and their strong support of the rules-based international order, which are values and characteristics that they share with NATO allies. So, if anything, I think the question is not so much as, are the IP4 fleeting as are we going to see more countries that NATO wants to engage in this region? But I think these countries certainly are talking to NATO and being pursued by NATO because of the nature of the kinds of countries they are. And I think they're able to provide an insight for our allies in Europe into what's happening in the region that's really not replaceable by anyone else. So I don't see these partners becoming less important anytime soon.
Thank you. John, I'm going to put a question to you that sort of follows on something you said, which obviously one of the things that brought this relationship between NATO and our Indo-Pacific partners closer was the concerns about China. So how do you describe it, characterize it, frame it in such a way that it doesn't play into the narrative that this is about constraining, encircling, and keeping China down, that this is actually that NATO has a hidden agenda against the PRC, and that this is really all aimed at China? How do you avoid playing into that narrative? Because that's a narrative that is going to make it more difficult for some countries to work with NATO, and it's also going to be an issue within their publics. So what's the narratives? How do you describe this work in such a way that doesn't play into the Chinese narrative here?
Well, I think this is especially difficult because, even in our own country, what is the percentage of Americans who really understand NATO and the alliance and what it does, and our relationships even bilaterally with nations abroad. So to educate publics on this is very difficult. But Chinese leadership, I think you could certainly target. I think Doug hit a very strong point. This is not unusual. We have partnerships all over the world. Yep. And that's a good one to explain. It's good, as was discussed before, to talk about, this is not new in the Pacific. But I also think, maybe we shouldn't hide it so much. We should be proud of democracy standing together. We do that in Europe all the time and across the North Atlantic. We talk about being shoulder to shoulder with our allies to deal with threats to democracy. So, I know there's a risk there of making the Chinese feel isolated, but I also think in terms of deterrence and that message, we shouldn't hide it. We're proud democracies and supporting other democracies in the Pacific Rim.
Yep. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that one before? Doug, you're next if you're ready.
No, I agree with what John said. I think maybe another way to talk about it is that NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners and its other partners are talking about dealing with security challenges regardless of where they come from. So this is not aimed at the PRC, but we face challenges to our security from a lot of different sources. And as democracies that share a lot of common values, there's we see value in cooperating with them, regardless of where those challenges come from.
Mirna, you want to say a word about how the study group saw this issue, or you want to?
Yeah, I think the study group didn't see, I think one of the quotes we have in the report is from one of the study group members when we were talking about this question, who said they don't like to see their cooperation with NATO characterized as being about China because, quote, it's not all about China. There's many reasons with which NATO is cooperating in the region with these partners. So I think, talking about it as being something that's directed at China on the first instance isn't correct. And on the second instance, I think kind of plays into this Chinese narrative of,
Right.
The Asia-Pacific NATO, you guys are moving into the region, this is, going to sow sort of instability. So I think, there's a lot we can do with these partners in the region that, as Doug said, touch on issues that are transnational, that cross regional boundaries. And, at the same time, having a NATO eyes on the region is certainly, I think, helping to, I think, make these partners feel more secure and feel as though, people are paying attention what's going on, which certainly, whether it's intended to or not, has a deterrent effect on China in terms of its sort of desire to have military adventurism.
Ellison, I want to come to you. I want to get your view on this question, but I want to frame it in a little different way. And just ask, how does the Indo-Pacific region perceive NATO at this point, and the Indo-Pacific partner relations? And what is the U.S. government doing to sort of shape the perceptions in the regions?
Sure. Taking a little bit of a step back for a minute, and I think reflecting on what you heard a little bit, the Deputy Secretary said, from the United States view, looking at this partnership and our engagement with the region, with these allies and partners in the region, it has been part of our strategy. It's consistent with the strategy laid out, the national security strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, that deepening our engagement between allies and partners across the board to counter transnational challenges is at the core of this vision. Doing so, again, the Deputy Secretary touched on sort of this idea of the lattice work. We are committed to strengthening bilateral relationships in the region. We are committed to existing multilateralism in the region, committed to ASEAN centrality. All of these things we continue to do. They are consistent with one another. The NATO Indo-Pacific Partnership idea, it's been described a little bit as mini-lateralism, fit for purpose. These terms are thrown out, but really at its core is looking at ways to bring together allies and partners to address concerns. And so this, I think, very much is consistent with that idea. And then the other piece of that I would just say, which has been touched on a little bit here, is that we do need to do a better job and more consistent job messaging. I think it's incumbent on all of us to do and strengthen our public messaging in the region to talk more about what this is and is not. And then at the same time, or the flip side of this, to counter the rampant disinformation about it that we've talked about here today.
I really have always thought that these very old geometries that you're coming up, different groups of countries, appropriate for the purpose for which the group was pulled together and the subjects which we're going to deal with, is a very resilient structure over time, and also makes it a difficult target for China to shoot at it, quite frankly. I want to, Doug, ask a question for you that was given to me, and I want to sort of put on the table. Is the NATO liaison office in Tokyo still under consideration? And would such an office affect the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, or would it change the nature of NATO?
So
Can I ask you that question without breaching?
Yeah, no, you can ask me that question.
You may not answer it, but that's okay.
I'll answer it. We're not talking actively within the alliance about
It is not.
not being actively discussed within
Yeah.
the alliance to establish a liaison office in Tokyo. In any case, it was blown way out of proportion in any case. NATO has liaison offices in a lot of places, has liaison office at the UN, and has one at the African Union, has one at the OSCE. These are standard way that we can increase partnerships and dialogue. Certainly no to the other two questions. This would not transform NATO or the balance of power, or would actually I think a lot was made out of something that would just be a way for us to have a mechanism to increase the dialogue that's already existing. It wouldn't symbolize any change in NATO's posture or approach.
One of the things that I take from this conversation that's useful is, and it's a good way to answer the China question, NATO has relations globally, you're basically saying, because it views security threats as coming from a variety of different directions, particularly transnational threats. And that therefore this is of a piece with where NATO has gone given the security situation challenges that it faces. And I think if we can frame it in that context, it makes it easier to answer the question, is this all about holding down China? I think it's been useful if you add that point. I want to pause for a minute. We have a number of folks online, and we said that we would give some of the questions from those online to the panelists here. Do we have some? Thank you so much. Rafael Moreto asks, can the panelists respond to how NATO might respond to other issues the Asia-Pacific faces, like North Korea, non-state armed groups, terrorist groups, and more? We'd like to take that one on. I'll have to draft somebody if we don't get a volunteer.
I could jump in, I guess, on that.
Thanks, John.
I'm sure Doug would probably back me up. The level of NATO's involvement in the Pacific region, is something that would be determined by all allies collectively. When you're making decisions by consensus, I think that would limit the scale and scope of involvement as in that question. Doesn't mean individual allies won't get along or carry out various actions in the region. And one of the real strengths of the alliance, I think, is that these issues, even if they're from faraway places like the DPRK, are discussed in the North Atlantic Council. Any threat to NATO territory or just issues of grave concern around the world are discussed almost every single day in the North Atlantic Council by all the members.
Has there been a discussion of North Korea per se, both in the North Atlantic NATO Atlantic? I've got the NATO, the NAC, as they say, and I've now forgotten what it's.
North Atlantic Council.
Thank you, North Atlantic Council. Have there been discussions of North Korea in the NAC, and is it a subject that NATO has talked about with the IP4?
I can answer that question. This
you.
is actually an interesting point, because when we looked at the history of NATO's engagement with these partners as a group, it's actually North Korea that spurs the first meeting of the IP4 with NATO.
Really?
Yeah, so that's in 2016. So again, this is before NATO even becomes interested in China as a security threat. And I can't remember the exact date, but it's in the report. Basically, since X year, the North Atlantic Council has issued regular statements on North Korea, and North Korea has appeared in the declarations of NATO's summit meetings regularly. So yes, NATO thinks about North Korea a lot, and it has certainly talked with these partners about North Korea.
I have a second question here from online. I'm going to give it a little context, I think. There's been a lot of discussion about, over the years, whether the perception of Europe and the United States about the China challenge is the same. I think there's a lot of people think there's been some convergence. It may not be on all fours at this point in time, but there has been some progress there. And this question from Laura Ballman is the following. What strategies is the U.S. considering to navigate the competition with China while maintaining the cohesion and cooperation within NATO? Ellison, do you want to take that one on?
I might, in a roundabout way, thinking about the question specifically, but let me start. I just wanted to piggyback on the last question too. Is slow to respond, and I'll try to come around. I do think we've touched on this a little bit here, but I think it's important to remember that these conversations, important conversations about security on any topic, and I do think we have a growing list of topics that are ripe for practical cooperation and further cooperation going both directions, Atlantic, Pacific, that these are also happening in the bilateral channels as well. So yes, the panel up here, we are specifically talking about NATO conversations with capitals in the Indo-Pacific, but this is kind of the bread and butter of a lot of conversations that are happening in different channels. And I guess I would just touch on partly my response to the second question, though, too, is, although I'm forgetting now the second piece of it, but just in how we think about the broader context and conversations with which we are addressing these in a variety of fora.
Right. I have a final question here, and then we're going to go to the audience for questions. It sounds technical, but I think it's important. John, this may be for you, and Mirna, you may have talked about it in the study. I'm told that NATO sent observers to the 2022 bilateral military exercise Keen Sword between Japan and the United States, that Australia participated, that South Korea, New Zealand, several NATO member states, and regional countries were invited to observe. Will we likely see more NATO observers at regional exercises in the Indo-Pacific in the future? And will we see NATO-flagged exercises in the Pacific anytime soon? NATO-sponsored exercises in the Indo-Pacific. Is that an evolution we're moving toward? John, you want to start? And Mirna,
Sure.
You want to comment on that?
So the last question about NATO-flagged exercises, I don't see that anytime soon. Again, because you have to get all 32 members of the alliance to approve something like that. And there are some allies who are just hesitant to show the NATO flag in the Pacific Rim. But really, I hope that they continue to visit exercises and to have exchanges, on a host of things when it comes to war fighting, in particular, because I come from being just recently a professor at a war college. The character of war is changing so rapidly, and a lot of that is being driven by China, and so I would think these Western nations, all of the democracies, again, around the world, should be learning from each other as much as possible. I mean, this should be one of our greatest strengths, is our ability to interact and share information, tactics, techniques, and procedures, what equipment each nation is developing, and figure out how to best use all that in order to deter and protect our countries. So maybe not flagged exercises, but learning from each other, and certainly those nations, in particular Australia, they come and observe many exercises in Europe. And when I was assistant secretary, I had Australians working on my staff. I mean, so they are very integrated into the alliance.
Mirna, did the expert study group deal with this issue?
We couldn't possibly answer that question better than John, so I'll desist.
Great. All right, I think that concludes our conversation up here. I think we should go to the audience. If you'd raise your hand, we have microphones that will come your way. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. And you can address a specific member of the panel, all the members of the panels, or just put a jump ball and someone will grab it.
Hello, my name is Kayla Orta. I'm Senior Associate for Korea Research at the Wilson Center. I just returned from some travel in Seoul and Tokyo, where we had some conversations about NATO. So thank you very much for this excellent and timely event. Looking forward to reading the report further. I'd like to go back to one of the comments made earlier by the Deputy Secretary about multilateralism and minilateralism. I know this is a point in conversation. We talk about it a bunch, but particularly in the trilateral space, I should clarify the US, Korea, Japan trilateral space. I'm curious how that form of multilateralism might be reinforced or encouraged through the AP or IP4. And maybe a follow-up question to that, thinking a little bit down the road, are there ways to institutionalize this partnership and relationship more tangibly as we move forward in those spaces as well? Thank you.
Ellison,
Do you want me to take that? Sure,
Yeah.
I can take a first bite at it. I think to your first question, my answer is very simple, and it follows what the Deputy Secretary said, talking about Ambassador Emanuel, and it literally talks through this concept with using lattice work. And again, the Secretary of State likes variable geometry, but the idea, you can do this thing with your hands, is that you're connecting partners. There are overlapping circles, whether they're around substance, around issues, around the configuration itself, but the idea is that you're sort of covering in a nimble way a variety of circumstances that come up. And in a sense, getting to your second question, developing and weaving the fabric, to bring in another analogy here, that is making that stronger for the future going forward. The other piece of your second question that I alluded to earlier, I think, is the deepening of the bilateral relationships that are at the heart of these trilateral, minilateral, other groupings are really what bind it to. And as the Deputy Secretary said, we talk a lot about NATO with the Indo-Pacific, but I would just, highlight again the strength of those relationships going the other way as well. And really the outreach and engagement that we see from the Indo-Pacific, from Tokyo, from Seoul, from Wellington, from Canberra, with capitals in Europe, both with NATO and again on a bilateral level. And that strength, again, we could keep the analogy going all day, but the bindings there are just getting tighter and tighter.
Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Thank you so much for great presentations and a great program today here at the Institute and a great report. What else can be done on the road to the NATO summit to ensure that this summit is not upended by events in Ukraine? Fortunately, the aid package passed. But what else can be done to ensure that this summit is indeed not the fleeting moment, but is part of an emerging trend in international security, that these four countries are contributing and working closely with NATO in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Who would like to start? Doug?
I think it's probably my turn. I think there's a lot we can do. Summits are always sort of the waypoint for the alliance that we build up decisions for and chart the way forward. And so we should be charting the next steps also with the Indo-Pacific partnerships. I think that probably looks less like some formalizing of it and more about us trying to find ways where we might be able to enhance the cooperation that exists. So a lot of what we do in the Indo-Pacific with Indo-Pacific partners right now is really just talking to each other, exchanging information, exchanging lessons learned. That's like 90% of what is going on, despite all the hoopla. I think we're starting to look at ways that we might advance that into more ways of actual cooperation. Things like, I think we're talking about having them participate, for example, on NATO's AI technology board, things like that, where they could make meaningful contributions to the dialogue going on in NATO and benefit from it themselves as well.
John, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think, as Doug said, these summits sometimes cause the alliance to turn in a certain direction, normally after some kind of a shock. I think during our time there, the rise of Islamic State, for example, caused NATO and the West to turn in a certain direction. The invasion of Ukraine, I think, falls right into that category. But I think in many ways, this summit will be more of a continuation of work, to solidify the industrial base, to make sure that allies and partners are producing the weapon systems that they should to defend themselves. This steady rise in defense spending, I think, is something that maybe would be solidified in this summit. But having worked there and we've all gone through the pain, at least Doug and I, of negotiating these documents, it all presses against what the market will bear about what allies are willing to do in consensus. So I think just a continuation of strengthening resolve to defend is what you'll see.
Ellison?
Just to note quickly, it really highlights a messaging opportunity for us, I think, too, along all of the lines that we've talked about here, both to get the message out, reinforce the language and the official documents themselves, and reinforce, as has been said, that we're building on something that we have done. Not for nothing that this will be the third consecutive. So I think it's an opportunity that we seek to take advantage of.
Other questions? Ian, you've got to have a question over there. I mean, I know you too well.
Hi, thanks. I'm Ian Bernstein from the Atlantic Council. As the United States and Europe works towards a more common approach to their shared interests in the Indo-Pacific, you would think a strategy should have, multiple elements: an economic dimension, an ideological dimension, and perhaps a military dimension. What do you envision that military dimension including, and is there a role for it in NATO? Particularly in light of the fact that many of our European allies actually contribute forces to RIMPAC. They have a very active presence in the Indo-Pacific. It may not be huge, but it's there. So it makes eminent sense to me that as part of a comprehensive U.S.-European strategy towards our interests in the Indo-Pacific, there ought to be a more robust military dimension. NATO would be a natural home for it. And maybe we ought to be thinking more aggressively, to lack of a better word, more ambitiously when it comes down to leveraging the capabilities NATO can bring to the region in terms of military exercises and such.
So I'll jump on Ian's question. It's almost like he's reading my talking points from a couple years ago. No, I think, cooperation in the field at sea is invaluable. As a former military guy, as a Marine infantry officer, I'll tell you that when you operate with another country, you learn so much. Seeing their forces in action, you develop relationships that last for years, for decades. Just by training with them, you see equipment and how they're using it, and that it all goes back to capitals and helps foster this political will, even above the military levels, to do more. So absolutely, even though I say I don't think you'd see NATO flagged exercises there, certainly the military committee at NATO can and should foster more direct cooperation, more exercising together, sharing technology, sharing best practices, more working together.
Anybody else want to say a word on that before we go to our next question? I've got two more online. One is from Harrison Holman, who asks, how is NATO and the IP4 thinking about a rise in Sino-Russian relations when it comes to the Arctic?
Well, I can take that one, I guess, since you mentioned that I do
part of your portfolio.
My portfolio. So, well, I should say, first of all, there's been a big change in NATO with Finland and Sweden joining. So with those two Arctic nations now in NATO, 7 of the 8 Arctic nations of the world are NATO allies. So NATO, there's a lot more of the Arctic in NATO now, and there's a lot more NATO in the Arctic. So there's naturally more of a focus on Arctic and Arctic security in NATO. And we're watching very closely, well, first Russia, as Russia has built up its military infrastructure in the Arctic and increased its presence. And then we've seen signs of increased cooperation between Russia and China. We've seen them exercise jointly, even off of the coast of Alaska. We've seen joint maritime exercises, and we've seen them operating increasingly in the Arctic. And so that is a major area of concern because I think we still have the ambition to keep conflict and tension low in the Arctic, and it's a concern what is happening with the increased militarization from Russia. And as Russia is sort of in a disadvantage, as Russia basically is weaker and needs China more, there's the risk that they feel that Arctic is one place where they can give more, and that would, in terms of access into the Arctic, and that would be something that would be a concern to all of us. So I think NATO's watching that closely, and secondly, there's just more of an imperative for strong deterrence and defense in the Arctic right now given the Russian buildup that we've seen, and I think that's something that you've seen NATO respond to.
This next one, I think, Ellison, is coming your way. One of NATO, this is an anonymous question, no name attached. One of NATO's members, Hungary, signed a security agreement with China. What impact could such an agreement have on NATO and allies?
So I think I'm going to punt some of this Doug's way, but I think understanding the complexities of, working through issues on the European continent, I think we've seen this play out several different issues. Again, there are bilateral challenges, pieces, things that we've discussed around the board. So I don't think in this context the answer is any different. But I don't know, Doug, if there's an institutional piece.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not familiar with that particular agreement, so it's a little hard for me to comment on it. But just to say, NATO per se doesn't have can't direct to its member states what to do with their approach to China. We use it as a place where we can share our views and make our assessments clear. And I think you've seen, as you commented, we have seen actually a real convergence in recent years, mainly with a much heightened awareness in Europe on the challenges posed by the PRC and their economic and foreign policies, and the need to build collective resilience to all of those. Obviously, different nations may take a different approach to that, but I think collectively we've seen a big change, a sea change in Europe, and much closer alignment with the United States on that issue.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? All right, we're going to give you 5 minutes back on your day. Mirna, I want to thank you for the report. I want to give you the last word, if there's anything you'd like to say before we adjourn.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the other panelists. You guys have really, made our event so much more interesting than it would have been otherwise. We can't just have me talking about the report. But we do really encourage everyone to take a look at the report. There's a lot of detail in there that I wasn't able to go into here. And it's really something that I think as we head towards the summit is really going to be on the minds of American policymakers and certainly on the minds of our IP4 partners. So if we can do one takeaway for you, don't forget that these relations continue to evolve and they continue to be important, and we will all watch this space.
So let me thank you all for coming and participating in this event, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.